Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So yet again, another expose on the Metropolitan Police, which shows not just racist and misogynistic behaviour, but extremely violent attitudes and conduct towards the very members of the community they are hired to protect and serve. The Met Police continue to refuse to accept independent reports describing them as institutionally racist, homophobic and misogynistic, despite the insane amounts of evidence. And if the leadership of the Met will not face the full facts, they won't ever solve the problem. So what would solve the problem? Well, let's go through a few ideas. But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So the BBC's Panorama has carried out undercover reporting on extreme behaviour at a police station in London. Not one or two officers, but so many that they felt comfortable airing most of their disgusting views and exploits openly. The undercover reporter was new to the station, and yet the experienced plods were happy to openly talk about their degrading views of both women and ethnic minorities as well as Muslims. And were actually told that they were keeping a lot of it under wraps because he was new. So there was even more extreme stuff they weren't talking about, at least not to begin with, because of the new guy. I'll link a BBC article, actually a couple of ones that are interesting, on some of the main points in the description if you want to check out the details. And this isn't even an isolated case. The Met is constantly being dogged by these scandals. It's not, the Tories were describing it as a few bad apples. It's not a few bad apples, because every time something like this comes out, it turns out that these officers have been openly behaving like this for years in full view of colleagues, right? When you have a bad apple in an organisation, they tend to get outed. And this is going to continue to be so until the Met faces up to the scale of the problem. Yet every time something like this happens, and it happens a lot, the Met leadership behave as if we are just talking about these few bad eggs who need to be sacked so they can move on. The Met chief, Mark Rowley, was once again talking about this today. How they're dismissing these bad coppers, and he wants them all off the payroll. But he still doesn't accept that there's an institutional problem with the Met. And note the distinction here between dismissal and wanting them off the payroll. The Met leadership just wants these officers gone, right? They think that that's all they want. They just want them gone. And the tidiest way is if they resign, as many have done in similar situations before. How many times have we read about plods that just resigned before the disciplinaries? But that means they face no consequences, other than needing a new job, but that was going to happen anyway. They get to tell future employers they left the police force. Any number of reasons they can make up for that. Working the police is incredibly stressful. You can say, toxic culture, wanted to get out of it, right? You could make anything up. It won't be on future job applications because they were kicked out for like beating up defenceless people or threatening to rape women. But the refusal to accept institutional problems is a barrier to serious progress. The idea that officers can behave like this and then just be allowed to resign. This despite the fact government-backed reviews have concluded there is an institutional problem. Time and again, it's not just one report. You've had reports under both Labour and Conservative governments saying the same thing. So the situation to me is this. The Met are too defensive about their own problems. They're not condoning the behaviour, but they are refusing to accept it's as widespread a problem as independent reports say it is. That means they will never actually solve it. They may make progress. Rowley insists he's making progress, but they will not solve the problem. That means the solution has to come from the outside. So let's consider what some of those might be. Well, if you look at Rowley's statement first, that he wants those officers, removed, and you think, is that enough? Let me draw a parallel situation in teaching, my former profession. So you sometimes have a problem in education that the odd teacher doesn't respect professional boundaries and has relationships with students. It's not a widespread problem, as racism, homophobia and misogyny are in the Met Police, but it happens often enough to be an issue. So the last Labour government legislated. The age of consent in the UK is 16. So if a 24-year-old has a relationship with a 17-year-old, it's all perfectly legal, right? However, if the 24-year-old is a teacher and the 17-year-old is a student in their school or college, that is now not just a sacking matter. The teacher can face criminal charges. They could find themselves in prison for up to 5 years. Why is the head of the Met talking about just wanting officers gone? who have been seen stamping on already restrained prisoners, or talking about shooting foreigners just for being foreign, or dismissing the threat from a man stamping on his pregnant girlfriend's stomach and releasing him to go and do it again. We have this mad system in the UK whereby people with more authority in society somehow face lighter penalties for abuse of that power. Those with the most power have the most responsibility and should face tougher penalties for abuse, not lighter ones. The officers reported on in the documentary seemed to know that their behaviour was unacceptable. They kept talking about the mask, apparently. I've not seen the documentary. I've read the BBC's own reports on it. They kept talking about the mask that they throw up whenever there's someone new around. So they knew that their behaviour wasn't justified. They didn't actually, in their own warped sense, think it was okay. They knew it wasn't okay. At one point, the sergeant even took the reporter, the undercover reporter, to one side to warn them against talking about certain things in certain places where it might be recorded. Little did he know he was being recorded. So they knew they were abusing their positions. There should be specific criminal offences for this specific form of abuse. In the same way, the last Labour government legislated for teachers. Officers found to be abusing their position like this shouldn't simply be allowed to resign or even sacked. They should be prosecuted. If you were a retail worker caught with your fingers in the till, you wouldn't just be sacked, you'd be prosecuted for theft. So why aren't we prosecuting police officers who are violently attacking defenceless prisoners, or letting violent domestic abusers walk free to further attack or murder their partners? There needs to be severe penalties if you are going to stop this behaviour. You have to raise the risk of the behaviour. Of course, the penalties themselves aren't enough if officers are confident they won't be caught. Again, it's about risk. For the risk to be high enough to stop the behaviour, not only does the penalty have to be severe, but you also have to think there's a good chance you are eventually going to get caught, right? So you need a more robust means of monitoring police officers in their work. Given that the Met Police refuse to face up to the scale of the problem, they're clearly not going to deal with it in-house. All they do is take action when some journalists expose it in the news. That's no good. You need a body which is responsible for ensuring those standards are maintained in the force. It shouldn't be possible for a plod to be able to behave like this for decades without being noticed. So as well as toughening up legislation on police behaviour, the government also need to create an enforcement body which is separate to the police. May even need to be separate to the Home Office, I don't know. But if the Met won't put their own house in order, someone else has to. The downside here is I suppose you might create a them and us situation, more fortress mentality, but that's surely better than allowing the Met to continue like this. Because we're going to be in a situation, in 10 years' time, there's going to be more coming out, in 20 years' time. And the head of the Met at the time will talk about progress made and it's still not good enough. And we'll still be here in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time. I mean, I compare this to the police force in my part of the country where I grew up, South Yorkshire. They massively disgraced themselves when I was young, during the miners' strikes, then over the Hillsborough disaster. It took a long time, but the Hillsborough cover-up eventually came out, and we're getting an inquiry into Orgreave soon as well. Where's the equivalent robust action to tackle the problems at the Met? Because our approach seems to be to just appoint someone to lead the Met who wants to deal with the problem. And I don't doubt Rowley wants to deal with the problem, but he's not. It's all very well having reviews and investigations. If the Met leadership can reject the main conclusions, that's no good. If I were in government and I ordered a review into the problems within an organisation like the Met Police and the Met dismissed some of the findings, I'd be looking at ways to use outsiders to sort them out. Because I go back to my starting point. The first step in solving a problem is to acknowledge the problem. If you try to downplay the problem or the scale of the problem, you cannot possibly come up with the right solution. You might make something a bit better, but you won't solve it. The Met Police are firefighting. They're kicking out officers when it's brought to their attention that these things are happening, mostly when journalists are catching them out in the act. What action is there to deter the behaviour in the first place? What progress has been made on that? What action is there to catch them in the act before journalists do? Because let me tell you how journalists are catching them. Has to be tip-offs. They have to learn about these things. Tip-offs from serving officers who are observing this and know that their own internal procedures will do nothing. So inevitably, they must be anonymously going to journalists as a last resort. It's a sign that the decent coppers have got no faith in their own people to sort these problems out. And finally, I would just say, so some people are again inevitably saying Rowley, the Met chief, should resign. I don't actually agree on that one. He's trying to take action. He doesn't make excuses. And he would just be replaced by someone who at best, will think the same way. It needs external intervention. The thing about an institutional problem is the institution cannot deal with it. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.